Hi, welcome back. History 358, week 4. Last time we talked about how the Bolshevik regime, from its very inception, embraced the idea of revolutionary violence as an acceptable, indeed ethically, morally justifiable strategy to deal with enemies of the revolution. And again, enemies of the revolution, as we've seen, were defined not only in terms of individuals, but more broadly in terms of the class uh, group to which they belonged, members of the bourgeoisie, so-called former people, bывшие люди, etc., etc. When we were talking about the uh, sort of theoretical justification for violence that the Bolsheviks put forward, um, I pointed out two related factors. One, the kind of revolutionary mindset, which we can trace back through the Western radical tradition to the time of the Jacobins in the French Revolution. The idea that the stakes of the revolution are so high, the ends are so noble and worth pursuing that any means whatsoever can be justified. And that's a conviction that the Bolsheviks held very dearly. And in Bolshevik writing, in Bolshevik propaganda, tracing it all the way back to Marx's writings in the 19th century, there is again this idea that the old world, the capitalist order, was a system based on violence and exploitation. And thus it will require equal, if not greater, violence to tear down that old world. And I want to show you a very good example of that thinking. How do I do this? There we go. Let me go to this slide here. I've mentioned over the past few lectures the Internationale, the Soviet national anthem, adopted by the Bolsheviks in 1918. It remains the national anthem of the Soviet Union until 1943, when it's replaced with an even catchier tune. We'll talk about that later. The Internationale was the anthem of the Paris Commune of 1870, when the Parisian socialist radicals romantically, but ultimately futilely, attempted to create a socialist bulwark right in the very heart of the French capital. They were brutally crushed. But their anthem, the Internationale, spread around the world, spread across the globe, translated into all languages. It became the sort of international national anthem of the global socialist movement at the end of the 19th century, and still is to a certain extent to this day. So when the Bolsheviks come to power, the Internationale becomes their national anthem. I would play it for you, except that when I experimented with this, it booms and echoes, and it sounds terrible. So what I'll do is go into Moodle, and I'll put a YouTube video on there if you want to listen to it and sing along. It's a very stirring, rousing tune by design. It's intended to rouse the workers of the world toward the cause of revolution. But I just want to draw your attention, because embedded in these very lyrics is this conviction that violence is a necessary component of creating the new socialist order. Look right here in the first verse. We'll rip down this brutal world of violence. Right? We'll rip down the capitalist order, an order based on oppression and exploitation. We will raise it, tear it down to its very foundations, and then we shall build a new one for ourselves. To create the new world requires an act of catalytic violence to tear down the old world. And in the final lyrics, the final verse, we see that idea again. We, the workers of the world, the great international army of labor, we are the ones who have the right to own the land. The parasites, the exploiters, don't, and never shall again. A new world is coming. And again, note here the dehumanization of the class enemy, the parasites, right, who suck the blood of the workers. And though great thunder rolls and crashes above the pack of mongrels and butchers, the bad guys, the class enemies, the sun shall shine all the brighter over us and give its light to our labors. So the Bolsheviks are coming out of an intellectual tradition that sees violence, again, as a necessary component of the creation of the new world, of the new order. The old world will not go slinking silently into the night. Marx has taught us that the dictatorship of the proletariat, established after the fall of capitalism, must exterminate, root out, destroy its enemies, lest the revolution fall. And that idea is embedded in all manner of, from the national anthem through some of the visual images that we'll look at today as well. So there's an intellectual justification, a moral and ethical justification for violence. But the other imperative behind the Bolshevik deployment of violence following the October Revolution was, as we've seen, the very precarious, weak position in which Lenin and the new regime found themselves after the October Revolution. The Bolsheviks are not just imagining enemies in their midst, there are enemies in their midst. The assassination attempt on Lenin on August 30th, 1918, the assassination of Moisei Uritsky, the Petrograd boss of the Cheka, confirmed, if any confirmation were needed for Bolshevik stalwarts, that enemies are aligned against us. And thus begins the Red Terror. The outbreak of civil war in 1918 amplifies and accelerates this thinking. And so what I want to do today is talk about the Russian Civil War, 1918 to 1921. You'll see different end dates for the Russian Civil War because it doesn't end in a treaty of Appomattox like the American Civil War. The Russian Civil War just kind of burns out after 3-4 years of brutality and complete violence. And I want to think about the various factions involved in the Civil War. I don't want to give a really blow-by-blow account because the Civil War is really a conflict that defies a very simple and easy narration. But if you want to read more about the Civil War, there's a pair of English historians, Evan Maudsley and Jonathan Smeal, who have written a lot of good stuff on the Civil War. And if you're interested, I can point you towards some of their writings. I want to think also about some of the reasons why the Reds, the Bolsheviks, win the Civil War, how they emerge triumphant, or maybe triumphant is too much a word. They stagger out of the war victorious, their enemies having exhausted themselves and been defeated in battle. I want to look at some of the visual propaganda that the various sides put out. And I think that goes a long way towards helping us understand some of the reasons for the Bolshevik victory. I want to again think about this question of violence. The Civil War is a conflict that sees intense acts of physical violence visited on not only combatants, soldiers, but also civilians as well. And then I want to think a little bit about the long-term legacies of the Civil War that we'll see through the decades to come, that will be an important formative dimension on the culture of Stalinism in the 1930s, this idea of eternal vigilance, the need for watchfulness because there are enemies everywhere, and what we might think of as a kind of Civil War mentality, a sort of perpetual defensive fortress mentality that enemies are encircling us, and with it, a kind of overweening, brash confidence that we Bolsheviks can not only meet the enemy, but destroy him. The Civil War slogan that there is no fortress a Bolshevik cannot storm. So the Civil War in many ways sows the seeds of Stalinism to which we'll turn in weeks to come. Okay, so again, Bolshevik violence has to be understood in this context of relative weakness. The Red Terror is born in the context of civil war. The Civil War witnesses an intensification of these state strategies of violence that we've been talking about. Violence deployed by the Cheka, the state agency empowered by the new Bolshevik government to root out enemies. Violence, as we'll see, perpetrated by units of the new Bolshevik fighting force, the Red Army, to which we'll turn in a moment. The Civil War in Russia is often told as a tale of the Reds versus the Whites, the Bolsheviks versus the anti-Bolshevik forces. The colors here are, again, part of this 19th century tradition that actually goes back even further into the 18th century. Red had been, as we've said before, since the 19th century, the color of the socialist movement. Naturally, the Bolsheviks clad themselves in that color. The idea of white as an anti-revolutionary or counter-revolutionary emblem or color actually goes back to the time of the French Revolution, when the forces who were fighting for the king, for the restoration of the old order against the revolutionary regime, used the color white to symbolize their cause. And so we have, the Reds and the Whites fighting on either side of the Russian Civil War. That's just one dimension, and it's the most notable dimension. But the Bolshevik regime was actually faced by a half dozen various opposition groups during the Civil War that were fighting to unseat the new regime. So one difference between the Russian Civil War and, say, the American Civil War or the English Civil War of the 17th century is that the battle lines, both on the map and within society, are messier. But just to give you some sense of how messy that is, I'll just sort of sketch out briefly some of the various factions who are warring for control of Russia in the Civil War. First, you have the White Armies, sometimes known as the volunteer armies. And the White Armies were made up of former Tsarist generals, Tsarist officers, who wanted to restore the old autocratic regime. Either put the Tsar or find some other hemophiliac, Romanov, put him on the throne, or create a kind of military strongman dictatorship, a kind of Napoleonic political system that would put power in the hands of a strong man. And in these series of photographs, you see the principal leaders of the White Armies: General Anton Denikin, Admiral Kolchak, and Baron Wrangel. There were others, but these were the three most notorious. So in the battle of Reds versus Whites, it's the Bolshevik army, to which we'll turn in a moment, fighting against the not always coordinated and often at each other's throats White armies of Denikin, Kolchak, and Wrangel. Adding further to the confusion of civil war, the Bolsheviks are beset on all sides by foreign troops. The Bolsheviks would refer to this as the foreign interventionists. Britain, France, the United States, Japan sent armed forces to Russia during the Civil War to secure their own economic interests. For the British and French, while the First World War was going on, they wanted to make sure that they could shore up defenses so that the Germans wouldn't sweep in. The Japanese, as you can see in this photograph, the Japanese sent tens of thousands of troops into the Russian Far East, into Siberia. Here you see Japanese forces marching in the Pacific port town of Vladivostok. Japan is trying to pull a land grab in Siberia. The United States sends troops into Siberia largely to counter the potential threat of Japanese territorial expansion. Again, the British and French are trying to prevent the Germans from grabbing Arctic ports, grabbing Russian military supplies, caches of ammunition, and using them on the Western Front. So you have, again, a situation that plays into the Bolshevik fear of encirclement. You have literally hundreds of thousands of foreign troops on Russian soil, troops from imperialist capitalist countries. It simply accelerates and legitimates this Bolshevik idea that the imperialist West and East, in the case of Japan, if we throw them in, the imperialist world is trying to crush the socialist experiment in its cradle. A third wave of opposition during the Civil War, you have SRs, you have cadets, you have other opposition parties who are fleeing Moscow and Petrograd, one step ahead of the Cheka, moving into the heartland of the Volga countryside, moving into Siberia, setting up rival anti-Bolshevik governments, proclaiming themselves to be the legitimate voice of the Russian people. Since the Bolsheviks have smashed the Constituent Assembly, we are now taking upon ourselves the task of representing the Narod, the Russian nation. These rival governments were not nearly so threatening to the Bolsheviks as the White Armies and the armies of the foreign interventionists, but it was nevertheless a real problem. In the western borderlands of the Russian Empire, former Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic republics, Finland, down into the Caucasus, you have also armed ethnic nationalist secession movements who are trying to break free from Bolshevik control. In fact, they're fighting against both the Reds and the Whites in order to assert their national political independence. Finally, fifthly, you have so-called green armies who are fighting both the Reds and the Whites. These are peasant rebels who have become disappointed, would be too mild a word. Disenchanted is too mild a word. They're angry. They're pissed off at the Bolsheviks' wartime economic policies, to which we'll turn next week. And they arm themselves, and they are fighting in massive numbers against both Bolsheviks, Reds, and Whites. This is in the Volga region of central Russia, the agricultural heartland, and also in Ukraine. So the Bolsheviks, already predisposed to see enemies under every branch, now, with the outbreak of civil war, seem certainly justified in their paranoia or suspicion or fear. There are enemies in our midst. There are armies massing on our borders. There is a concerted effort to destroy the socialist experiment. To combat these threats, the Bolsheviks need a real army. Not just a romantic revolutionary volunteer force of Red Guards, the militia who had defended the revolution in October 17, stormed the Winter Palace. We need a real, professional, disciplined, modern army. And immediately after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed in the spring of 1918, Trotsky is entrusted by Lenin with the task of creating the so-called Red Army. And Trotsky is the father of the Soviet military, the father of the modern Russian military. Trotsky creates the Red Army in such a way that it is organized along regular, disciplined military models. And this was a big debate within the party. Should we have, revolutions are not supposed to have standing armies. Revolutions have militias of romantic volunteers who offer their services, their bodies, their lives to the cause of the revolution. Imperialist powers, right, have standing armies. Trotsky says, look, if we're going to survive this, we need a real standing army. We have to create an army that can face off and hopefully win against our enemies in the field. So Trotsky reintroduces military discipline. He does away with the kind of romantic militia conceit of 1917 that enlisted men should elect their officers. No, officers will be appointed by the regular chain of command, going all the way up to Trotsky himself, People's Commissar for War. Well, to lead men in the field, you need experienced officers. You need veteran officers. We have a leadership problem, Trotsky says. How do we find experienced officers to lead our raw recruits into battle? Trotsky says, well, we'll use old Tsarist officers, right? We'll use officers from the old regime, and we will appeal to their sense of Russian patriotism. Your country needs you. We need you. Come fight for Russia. And if that doesn't work, we'll take their wives and children hostage. And if they won't fight for the revolution, if they won't fight for Russia, then we'll kill their families. And probably that latter mode of persuasion proved to be more powerful. Trotsky's recruitment or co-option of Tsarist officers into the newly formed Red Army was massive. By the end of the Civil War, you had more than 50,000 former Tsarist officers serving in the Red Army. And again, some within the party saw this as ideologically distasteful. Trotsky says, look, this is Marxist dialectics in action. We are building socialism with the bricks of capitalism. And Trotsky was fully prepared to toss aside the Tsarist officers once they had outlived their usefulness. So it's a great example of how the Bolsheviks were constantly thinking about the long-term, medium or long-term ideological goal. What are we trying to achieve? But what expedient measures might we take in the short term in order to hasten the achievement of that long-term goal? So there's always this, in early Bolshevik policy, there's always this kind of balancing act between remaining true to your ideological commitments, but having to make unavoidable concessions to reality. And we'll see that again and again and again. Trotsky manages to build a professional army that is also something new in modern history. It's also a revolutionary army. The Red Army becomes not only a fighting force, but becomes, as an institution, a school to teach raw recruits the principles of Marxist socialism. So these young recruits, as you can see in this photograph, young men taking target practice, they're taught not only how to fight, how to shoot, how to drill, they're also taught how to read. They're plucked right out of the village. They're given the basic rudiments of an education that many villagers lacked at this point. They receive not only a standard kind of literacy training, basic mathematics, but a political education as well. Each military unit, each division, each company in the Red Army had a special political commissar attached to it. And these men, and here you see in the middle a political commissar with his book under his arm, the political commissars would drill the men just as their instructors drilled them in shooting and marching. The political commissars would drill the men in the basics, the ABCs of communism. And the text by Bukharin and Preobrazhensky was one of the classic texts used by political commissars to train young Red Army recruits in the basic principles of what the revolution stands for, why we're fighting, what we're fighting for, what is our goal, what do we hope to achieve. This proves a very long-lasting legacy. When the Civil War is over and the enlisted men are demobilized, they go back home to their towns and villages, they take up party work, they take up government work. And former Red Army men play a very important role in staffing the provincial administrative party networks throughout the 1920s and 30s. And these guys become Stalin's men in the late 20s and 30s. But they have this Civil War education. They've been brought up in the crucible of civil war. They've had a rough and tumble education in the basics of Marxism-Leninism. They're not educated theorists like Lenin and Zinoviev and Trotsky. They've received a kind of battlefield education, a baptism by fire in combat, and also a kind of rough and ready familiarity with the very rudimentary basics of Marxist-Leninist thought. But those men, those Civil War veterans, become an important component of the political structure in the later 20s and 30s. So that's, again, one of these legacies of the Civil War. Let me just jump ahead a little bit. The nature of the Civil War was such that territory changed hands multiple times. The Reds and Whites are pushing each other back. To give you one example, the city of Kiev, today the capital of independent Ukraine, changed hands 16 times during the Civil War, between the summer of 1918 and the summer of 1920. In 2 years, the city of Kiev is under red and white occupation 16 different times. And across the length and breadth of Russian territory, the land was ravaged agriculturally. Every time the Reds took a town or the Whites took it back, there were brutal reprisals carried out against political opponents. You see in this photograph a young Bolshevik tied to the post, about to be tortured and executed by the Whites who have captured him. And you see this great contrast between the kind of old insignia of the old order that you see on the uniforms of the white soldiers and the kind of look of desperation or defiance, however you choose to read it, in the eyes of this young Bolshevik who is about to be shot. I've asked you this week to read a couple of stories by the great Russian writer Isaac Babel, the author of the so-called Red Cavalry tale. Babel was a Ukrainian Jew from the port city of Odessa. He made his early career by writing these terrific, evocative stories about gangster life and the Jewish underworld, the Jewish mafia in the town of Odessa. But when the revolution broke out, Babel declared himself on the side of the Bolsheviks, and he served as an embedded war correspondent with a cavalry unit, a Red Cavalry unit, a Bolshevik cavalry unit, fighting on the Western Front against the Whites. And he wrote this series of stories about his experience. And they're works of fiction, but they're drawn deeply from Babel's own bank of memories and traumatic experiences during the war. And I've asked you to just take a look at two very short stories. My First Goose, which is a great example of the adoption and embrace of casual violence, and a horrific story called The Letter. But what you see in those stories, particularly The Letter, is just how the Civil War tore families apart. Fathers against sons, brothers against brothers. And I think that helps to explain kind of the endemic, pervasive culture of violence that was the most characteristic element of the Russian Civil War. And again, if you're interested in reading more Babel, all of his work has been translated into English. Just one of the great Russian stylists of the 20th century. I want to warn you that some of these images we're about to look at are rather graphic. So I apologize if that's the right word, but they're important. I think they need to be seen, and I think they emphasize the point we're making here about the horror and scale of the fighting here. Photographs like this appear all throughout the years of Civil War. Huge piles of corpses. In this case, the Whites have taken a town and they are demonstrating for photographic posterity the victims murdered by the Bolsheviks, bodies by the wagon load, bodies often indistinguishable, bodies left in the snow. Now, the instruments of terror were not exclusively wielded by the Reds. The Bolsheviks consistently pointed out that the white armies were just as violent, if not more so, than the Reds, and that's true. Here you see some victims, suspected communists about to be hanged by white officers in a small provincial town. Let me show you if I can get over here really quickly. This is an example. This is a photograph taken by the Bolsheviks in 1919 in the Siberian town of Novosibirsk. And the title is Victims of Kolchak, victims of the Admiral Kolchak, the white admiral who has shot and just left the bodies frozen in these unnatural poses, leaned up by the Bolsheviks against this log cabin. Victims of Kolchak who were killed merely for their political convictions. When the Bolsheviks would liberate a town, again, they would always take photographic evidence, and they would also, for political, symbolic purposes, stage these grand ceremonial funerals for the victims of white terror. And here you see a photograph from a Siberian town, I think it's Novosibirsk, showing a red funeral, a Bolshevik funeral, this public spectacle staged to honor the victims of Kolchak, the victims of the white armies. Let me go back here. I think, again, victims of the Red Terror, an Orthodox priest shot by the Reds. The Bolsheviks, as we'll see when we get to culture building, declared war against the Orthodox Church, and many ordinary clergymen and high-ranking clerics fell victim to the Red Terror. Here, again, I apologize for the gruesomeness of this image, but it shows you the animalistic violence unleashed in the context of civil war. This is a captured white officer, tortured by the Bolsheviks, left hanging from this tree, impaled on a stake as a warning that this is what happens to enemies of the revolution. This is what happens to enemies of the people. And we might think, how do we make sense of images like this? How can we make sense of the terrible tortures and atrocities that were committed in the fighting of the Civil War? And again, how does a revolution which promises a message of emancipatory progress and freedom, and yet at the same time is utterly ruthless, utterly without compunction towards its enemies? And again, I think we have to get back to that point that I mentioned before about the ideological, moral justification of violence in pursuit of the glorious end, building socialism, but also the passions unleashed in the context of Red Terror, the animalistic, brutal violence. One observer at the time noted that the ethos, the prevailing spirit of the Civil War, could be summed up as follows: 2 eyes for 1 eye, all teeth for 1 tooth. And of course, not only the victims, but also the survivors bear with them the scars. This map shows you the Civil War at its height, 1919, 1920. And as you can see, on all sides, as those red arrows show, you have the foreign interventionists, you have the white armies marching, poised to take Petrograd. The tide turns over the course of 1920-21. The whites are pushed back. At the end of 1920, Baron Wrangels white armies evacuate the Crimean Peninsula. The very last of the foreign interventionist armies retreat from Russian soil at the end of 21, early 22. So the Bolsheviks win the Civil War. They outlast their enemies. There's not one decisive battle that you can say is the turning point of the Russian Civil War. And so there's a bunch of explanatory factors that I think help us make sense of the Bolshevik victory. This map, I think, goes some way towards explaining that. Tactical, strategic reasons for the Red victory. As you can see from this map, the Bolsheviks control the very heart of Russia, and this works to their advantage. It gives them somewhat of a strategic edge over the whites and other opponents because the Bolsheviks control interior lines of transportation, rail lines, communication lines, which are in disarray, but at least they're better organized than the whites who are coming from the periphery. So there's a tactical strategical advantage. The Reds, if you will, kind of hold the high ground. Another very important factor is that the anti-Bolshevik forces lack any real sense of unity. The white forces are divided against each other, whereas the Bolsheviks present a more united, a more coherent front. Not only are the white generals squabbling amongst themselves over who's going to be the top man once the war is over, but the whites bungle at every opportunity any chance of forging meaningful alliances with potential constituency groups that could have gone over to their side. I'll give you an example. Ukrainian nationalists who are fighting against Russian domination. They hate the Bolsheviks. They might easily have gone over to the side of the whites, but the white generals make the same mistake that the provisional government had made in 17. The white generals say, well, sure, you Ukrainians and Belarusians can help us, but just remember that when the war is over, we're going to basically put the empire back together again, and you guys will be part of the Russian empire. So naturally, nationalists on the borderlands had no love for the whites. They saw the whites as just ready to put them back in the chains of imperial domination. The whites also alienated potential socialist allies, potential liberal allies, by calling for a restoration of the autocracy. The cadets didn't want that. The SRs didn't want that. And the whites couldn't even build a relationship with the peasants because the whites, as part of their sort of plank or platform of political demands, says that we're going to restore the land to its rightful owners, meaning landowners, not peasants. So the whites had no peasant support to speak of. One observer at the time, a Russian liberal who had fled to Europe and was watching the Civil War unfold, could not believe that the whites were as clumsy and inept as they were. He writes that the whites appeared to have come out of a time capsule straight from 1913. He says, psychologically, the white forces and leaders conducted themselves as if nothing had happened over the past several years, where in reality, the whole world around them had collapsed. And in order to defeat the red enemy, the whites would have to undergo a rebirth. But nothing so harmed the white movement as their condition of psychologically staying put in circumstances which by 1918 had ceased to exist. So the whites, this observer tells us, are living in the past. They're caught up in the midst of a revolutionary situation, but their rhetoric, their appeal, their vision for a future Russia is a retrograde, backwards vision that nobody is really buying into in 1918. It does not register with the population at large. It fails to resonate and win the whites' mass support, which they would have needed in order to beat the Bolsheviks. So again, by 1918, the revolutionary spirit has swept away the ideals of the old order, and the whites are, they seem like mannequins from the past, spouting slogans that nobody is terribly interested in. So once the sort of genie of revolution has been let out of the bottle, it's not going to be stuffed back in, and nobody wants to go back to 1913, except for the whites. Another factor in the Red victory is that the Bolsheviks, by contrast to their white opponents, the Bolsheviks, the Reds, were masters of propaganda. And they utilized this in numerous ways. The whites were mostly old-fashioned military men. They didn't have political experience. They weren't used to the political art of persuasion. They could not compete with Bolshevik agitators and Bolshevik propagandists, most notably Trotsky himself, shown here in the center of this photo, who more than any figure galvanized the Red Army. Trotsky, in his famous armored train, zipped up and down the front lines, delivering tens of thousands of speeches, inspiring the soldiers, reminding them what they're fighting for, absolutely tireless, indefatigable in his propaganda work during the Civil War. Trotsky deserves enormous credit. Of course, that credit was denied him by the Stalinist historical falsification machine when Trotsky was pushed out of any chance of taking power, and Stalin consolidated his power. The history of the Civil War was rewritten. Trotsky is erased. Stalin himself is elevated. But the truth is that Trotsky was the key figure in galvanizing the spirit of the Red Army. Propaganda plays a key role here. The Bolsheviks succeed in besting the whites because of their mastery of propaganda. Now again, when we're talking about propaganda, we have to be a little bit clear about what we're talking about. Propaganda, in the era of fake news in the 21st century, we often assume that propaganda means something that is false. Not necessarily so. Propaganda, as it emerged in the turn of the 20th century, as it was deployed by all combatant nations during World War I, propaganda just means a mass message that is constructed and then distributed for broad audiences. It is propagated, it is made public, it is spread, it is disseminated, distributed, and the Bolsheviks are great students of propaganda. They'd done propaganda work in the factories before the revolution. They were skilled at this, and they took those skills and they deployed them on a mass scale during the period of Civil War. The Bolsheviks were able to use revolutionary slogans, as we saw in 1917. They're able to use a revolutionary discourse, a way of talking that resonates with the people. They're able to mobilize the masses with images, with slogans, with posters, songs, radio broadcasts that convey why they're fighting and what they're fighting for. Again, I'll see if I can post a YouTube video of this song. This is one of the most famous Civil War songs, a Red propaganda song called White Army, Black Baron. And it rips the White Army apart, and it accuses Baron Wrangel, with some justification, of trying to force the Tsar back upon us. We don't want that. So we Red Army men with our tough, calloused fists will fight back against the whites. We'll fight this last decisive battle, a line straight out of the Internationale. We'll fight it to the death against our enemies, because from the wilds of Siberia all the way to the North Sea, the Red Army is the strongest army of all. And we'll tear down the old world and build the new one. It's a rousing, powerful song, and it gets raw recruits excited. It gets them fired up, and it gives them a reason to fight. The whites have nothing to compare with this. The Reds, unlike the whites, use so-called agit trains, agitational propaganda trains zipping along the rails of central Russia with agitators, propagandists, who are showing film reels, who are showing cartoons, who are teaching the people what the war is about, why you should support the Reds, why you should reject the whites, what we're fighting for. So the Bolsheviks are just masters of this kind of propaganda. This particular lesson here, Down with the Bagmen, down with the kulaks, the rich peasants who are in league with the whites, who are hoarding grain and creating food shortages and hardship for the rural population. We'll talk more about economic speculation next time. So again, let's take a look at some examples of white propaganda, some examples of Bolshevik red propaganda, and look at these side by side. A common thread running through white propaganda is that it portrayed the Bolsheviks as interlopers, as non-Russians. There's a strong anti-Semitic strain to much white propaganda, as we'll see. These unlawful usurpers have stormed into the sacred heart of Holy Russia. They're trampling everything that we hold dear, and they're trying to transform Holy Orthodox Russia into a godless atheist state. And you can see that message in this bit of white propaganda, showing the Bolsheviks as godless blasphemers. The caption at the bottom reads, "Blasphemies in the church," blasphemies, acts of sacrilege committed in holy places by these Bolshevik soldiers and sailors who are lighting their cigarettes from incense censers, who are ripping the pages out of the sacred gospels, who are treating objects of sacramental significance in the Orthodox tradition with gross disrespect. And so the idea is, if this is okay with you, then by all means support the Reds. But if this angers you, if this insults your faith and sensibilities, then come over to the side of the whites, because this is what we're fighting against. We're fighting against acts of blasphemy. We're fighting against acts of Bolshevik sacrilege, atheist violence, and we are fighting to restore the moral center of Holy Russia. Another white poster demonizing Trotsky, and you can see the pronounced anti-Semitic overtones on display here. Trotsky is portrayed as this slouching demon with exaggeratedly Semitic features, and you see the blood-stained walls of the Kremlin, the damage that the Bolsheviks have already done. They've blasphemed and profaned the churches and cathedrals. They've hung their slogans from the bell towers. They've toppled the crosses, and a sea of bones and skulls lies at the feet of Trotsky. Interestingly, if you can make this out, the Bolshevik soldiers here are depicted as East Asians. They're depicted as Siberian, East Asian, Manchurian, non-Russian, right? So the emphasis here is that the Bolsheviks are not real Russians. The Bolsheviks are Jews. The Bolsheviks are obscure Asiatics, but they're not real Russians. The only real Russian in this poster is this poor fellow who's about to have his brains blown out by a Bolshevik soldier. So the idea is emphasizing this is a war to save Holy Russia against alien enemy outsiders, those who would seek to profane the Russian land with godless atheism and internationalism. So if this upsets you, come to our side, come to the white side. Again, that notion of the Bolsheviks as interlopers, as non-Russians, the caption here describes the Bolshevik punitive bands as made up of Latvians and Chinese who are violently expropriating bread, burning villages, and shooting peasants. So again, this seeks to recast the Civil War as a war of enemy invasion, the Bolsheviks as a foreign force running roughshod, committing violence against the true Russian heart and soul of the country. Another white poster with explicitly anti-Semitic overtones. The Bolsheviks are shown here as pagan priests sacrificing a figure who represents the autocracy sacrificing this figure on the altar of the Communist International with a crude carved version of Marx. And almost all the Bolsheviks depicted here, not accidentally, are Jews. Uritsky, Sverdlov, Zinoviev, Trotsky, Kamenev, and Radek. So the idea again, and this harkens back to all sorts of very nasty, very pernicious anti-Semitic folklore and legend about Jews murdering Christian children to use the blood in their satanic rituals. This is a classic example of white propaganda that is trying to play on deep-seated currents of anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish sentiment to turn anti-Semites against the Bolsheviks. Here you see the 30 pieces of silver. This traitor has betrayed the motherland. Kerensky is slinking away in the background. And again, the non-Russian visages of these Bolshevik militiamen emphasizes the non-Russian nature of this sacrifice. What Bolshevism brings to the people, nothing subtle here. You have in the background a very idyllic, classically Russian village, of course, a village church, and the villagers are fleeing as Death, the Grim Reaper, and in case you don't know he's Death, it says Death right there on his sickle. He's wearing a little kepka, a little cap, just like Lenin, and Death rides into town, and this is what Bolshevism brings the people: destruction, bloodshed, loss of life. These images that we see from white propaganda, there's tons and tons of images like this. And if you're interested, I can show you or point you in the direction of where to find more. But the white propaganda machine, unlike the Bolshevik propaganda machine, was very uncoordinated. These are some powerful images we're seeing here, but they appear in very limited print runs. They're not distributed in huge numbers. Simply put, the white propaganda machine, even working at full speed, cannot keep up with the Bolsheviks. Nor is it successful, again, in mobilizing the masses to take their side. The Reds, in their propaganda, are much more adept, much more skilled than the whites. Again, the whites are living in the past. All of these appeals are to go back to an idyllic past. There's no vision of forward motion in the white, in the annals of white propaganda, whereas the Bolsheviks are able to show what they're fighting for. The Bolsheviks are fighting, as they say, a principled war for values. We're fighting for socialism. We're fighting for freedom. We're fighting for land. So let's look at some examples of the red Bolshevik propaganda, just to make that distinction all the clearer. This is the most iconic image from the Russian Civil War. A Red Army soldier points to the viewer and asks, have you signed up as a volunteer? Have you done your part in the war? This is 1918, 1919. The imagery here is directly borrowed from, reminiscent of, British, American recruitment posters from World War I, that direct personal appeal to the viewer. The soldier, the representative of the state, calling upon the individual to do his duty. What have you done for the front? This young recruit asks the viewer. What have you done? We've signed up. We've gone off to fight. Bolshevik propaganda portrays the Civil War as a struggle to defend the revolution, to defend the workers and peasants against the counter-revolutionary forces of reaction. So here you see the caption reads, "The enemy is at the gates. Everyone come to the defense of Petrograd." And this was when the white armies of Wrangel and Yudenich were marching on the capital. So it's calling upon the workers, the proletarians, to defend the proletarian revolution. So again, while the whites are making appeals based on these ideas of national unity, hearkening back to a mythical past, the red Bolshevik propaganda is, again, aimed at class audiences, workers, peasants, soldiers, sailors. As you see quite nicely here, we shall not give up Petrograd. And you see the factories in the background dominating the city skyline, and this band of heroic workers, soldiers, sailors, and peasants, all the favored classes in the new Soviet society, are defending the city against these hosts of faceless little white invaders who are flying the old tricolor czarist flag. So the red flag against the flag of the old order. The heroes of the new Soviet society are defending the revolution, defending revolutionary society against a restoration of the old regime. The stakes are high in these images, right? To lose the Civil War means to lose all that the revolution has fought for. Civil War era propaganda always took pains to remind viewers of who we're fighting against. Not only what are we fighting for, who are we fighting against? Who are the enemies of the Soviets? Who is against the Soviets, it reads. And here you see the kind of typical class enemies that had been identified and had come under persecution for the Red Terror, during the Red Terror. Here, well, who are the enemies of the Soviets? Who's against the Soviets? Well, this guy with a big black flag that says "Down with the Soviets." But you see the stereotypical class enemies: the czarist officer, the top-hatted capitalist, the well-fed corpulent priest, and the kulak, the rich exploitative peasant. So again, these idealized types that will appear again and again in Soviet propaganda. These are our class enemies. They are on the side of the whites. They are against us. We are against them. And you see those types appearing in this other example of red propaganda. Who is on the side of Denikin? Who is part of Denikin's band? And the word banda is a very unflattering word, a gang, a horde, a host. Well, who's on the side of Denikin? Well, we see the white general Denikin depicted here. His banner reads, "Beat the workers and peasants," so clearly not an endorsement of class liberation, not the red flag of the Bolsheviks, but the tricolor of the old Romanov regime. And in contrast to the heroic workers and soldiers who are fighting for the revolution, we see Denikin's band as a bunch of rowdy, snarling drunks with the usual class enemies propping them up. The priest, the kulak, the officer, and representatives of the old, now fallen order, the capitalist, and this guy, Purushkevich, who was a representative of the Black Hundreds, whom I mentioned a couple of weeks ago. So these are Denikin's buddies. And if this is what you want to go back to, then support Denikin. If you support the new order, support us. Interestingly here, Purushkevich is shown carrying, hoisting an image of Nicholas II. By the summer of 1918, before the war really even got well underway, the Bolsheviks had taken measures to prevent Nicholas from ever coming back to the throne. Nicholas, since his abdication in the spring of 17, had been under house arrest, first by the provisional government, then by the Bolsheviks. Lenin and Trotsky had hoped that they could keep Nicholas alive. Trotsky really wanted this. Keep Nicholas alive until the end of the war, and then we'll put him on trial. We'll have a public show trial, just like Louis XVI had been tried by the National Convention during the French Revolution. We will try bloody Nicholas for his crimes against the Russian people. Unfortunately for Trotsky and the Bolsheviks, and unfortunately for Nicholas, once the Civil War broke out, as white armies approached closer to the small Siberian town where Nicholas and his family were being held under house arrest, the Bolsheviks got nervous. The last thing they wanted was for the royal family to be liberated by the whites, because then there'd be this rallying point. Bring back the Tsar. It would have been a disaster for the Reds. And so, with the white armies marching on Yekaterinburg, the small town where Nicholas and his family were held prisoner, the Bolsheviks decided to execute not only Nicholas, but his entire family, lest the autocrat be made a figurehead for the surging white movement. So Nicholas, his wife, his son, and all of his daughters, their doctor, their remaining 2 or 3 servants and maids, were executed by a Bolshevik firing squad on July 17th, 1918. Here you see Nicholas, his daughters, and the would-be heir to the throne, the young boy, Alexei. This red poster is very similar to the one we just saw with Denikin, except it's got Kolchak seated. And what you see is a kulak and a member of the bourgeoisie, a bourgeois, presenting Kolchak with the traditional Slavic gifts of hospitality, bread and salt, so suggesting that these class enemies are respectful toward Kolchak. This kind of limp-wristed priest is doing a half-assed benediction, the czarist police and officers on either side, and the flag, of course the tricolor flag that Kolchak is carrying, the insignia, the inscription on the flag is a rather intemperate quotation attributed to Kolchak. When he was faced with worker opposition, he said, "Shoot every 10th worker and peasant." And the Bolsheviks were quick to use that language against him to show Kolchak as an enemy of the working people. Wrangel is coming. Wrangel idiot. Baron Wrangel is coming. Proletarians to arms. So again, the usual retinue of counter-revolutionary forces marching in Wrangel's rear. Again, reminding us it's not simply a war against the white generals, but it's a war against the forces of global reaction and counter-revolution that supports them. Wrangel's march on Moscow was pushed back. Wrangel himself retreats to the Crimean Peninsula, and this Bolshevik poster reminds us that although Wrangel has been pushed back, Wrangel still lives. Finish him off without mercy. Bis pashadi, without mercy, which is exactly what this Red Army man, of course, is doing. And the last image I want to show you here, a slide, a poster from the very end of the war at the grave of counter-revolution. And you see these little markers denoting the names of all of the dead and defeated white generals. There's a little white general up in heaven saluting his comrades. And who is weeping for the dead? Who grieves the whites? The priest and the capitalists, class enemies. So the idea is that the war is over, but the war still goes on. The enemy has been defeated on the front, but the class enemies within are still seeking to undermine Soviet power. Even though we've won on the battlefield, we have not yet defeated the enemy within. Red propaganda portrays the Civil War always as heroic. It glosses over the atrocities, it glosses over the violence that it glorifies as this kind of abstract idea of violence in the service of building the new order. But the Civil War, as far as the legacies go, I think, this is what I want to close on. The Civil War creates this lasting idea of us versus them. With the end of the Civil War, as the soldiers ride home, they carry with them this idea that they've ingested through red propaganda, through the agitation trains, through the orators that they've heard, through the political commissars who have schooled them in the ranks of the Red Army, that though the war is over, the war goes on. The forces of international counter-revolution, the bourgeoisie, foreign imperialist powers, the aristocracy, are still versus the workers, the peasants, the Red Army. And so the Civil War becomes this incredibly important formative experience for the new Soviet regime and for the men who fought it and the men and women who lived through it. The Civil War becomes romanticized as this period of heroism, a period of valor, a period of self-sacrifice, and it becomes one of the foundational myths of the Soviet regime, just as the storming of the Winter Palace in October 1917. We, the infant Soviet state, were surrounded on all sides by international enemies who outnumbered us, who were more powerful than us. They sought to strangle us in the cradle. But yet, against all odds, the Bolshevik Party, the Red Army, the workers and peasants banded together to overcome and triumph. And the slogan of the Civil War, "There is no fortress a Bolshevik cannot storm," one of the rousing slogans of the Civil War. There is nothing we cannot do if we put our will towards it, if we put our effort behind it. That Civil War slogan is dusted off in the late 20s and 30s by Stalin with this kind of Civil War nostalgia. And when Stalin undertakes his second revolutionary transformation of Soviet society, mass industrialization, the collectivization of agriculture, he deliberately invokes that voluntarist, heroic, collectivist spirit of the Civil War. There is no fortress a Bolshevik cannot storm. There is no quota a collective farm cannot reach if it only tries hard enough. We defeated the whites. We beat back the imperialist interventionists. We can build socialism. That becomes an incredibly powerful and inspirational moment. The other legacy that I want to touch on here in closing is that the Civil War helps to create or establish in Soviet culture and society the sort of condition of permanent warfare. Again, the idea that the war is over, but the war still goes on. And that's a great, here you see, I think, a great example of that idea, a poster from the very end of the Civil War showing sort of the Soviet Russian territory anthropomorphized in the person of this Red Army soldier who is encircled on all sides by enemies of the revolution, foreign powers, class enemies, etc. And the caption says, "Будь на страже," be on guard, be ever vigilant, be ever watchful, right? Because the entire capitalist imperialist world is against the revolution. And so constant vigilance, constant watchfulness, not only with regard to enemies abroad, but more ominously even, total watchfulness, total vigilance against whatever enemies may be lurking within our borders. And that too carries over into the Stalinist period when the search for enemies will reach murderous proportions. So I want to stop here. I know we've had a lot to talk about this week, a lot to cover in anticipation of our Friday discussion, but I want to think again, as you're going through the readings and focusing for our discussion on Friday, think about the centrality of violence as reflected in the Babil stories. Look at Lenin's piece, All Out for the War Against Denikin, as an example of Bolshevik mobilization of the masses. Read Trotsky's Justification of Terror, and pay some close attention to Rosa Luxemburg's critique of the Bolshevik use of terror, because it's an excellent example of a non-Bolshevik socialist alternative that rejects the Bolshevik conviction that violence is necessary to create the new world, to create the new order. So we'll stop there. Plenty to talk about, plenty to chew on, and I look forward to talking with you all on Saturday, or Friday rather, excuse me. Let me stop the share here and stop the video, and I'll see you soon. Thanks.